Retroblasting is a YouTube channel for adult pop culture enthusiasts. Anyone under the age of 13 should only watch this channel with your parents. Retroblasting is not a children's channel. There's been something pulling at my brain for the past few years, and it involves the way fans have been expressing their love for various properties in this modern era of the many mediocre reboots and remakes. Fan behavior has never been logical. Fandom is driven intrinsically by emotion and passion. But since I'd say, let's use 2013's Man of Steel as a best guess benchmark, fan behavior and debate has become increasingly erratic. Yeah, geeks have debated things like Captain Kirk versus Captain Picard or Batman versus Superman for decades, but lately the water has reached a boil in online communities. I'm the last person you'd have to explain fandom's lack of self-awareness to. I've read it for 8 years in the comments on social media. The average fan doesn't even hear what comes out of their own mouth 90% of the time. Read their comments back to them from a transcript and it sounds like the ravings of a 21st century Don Quixote. And it's only getting worse. Logic, that revered concept of Spock, the now iconic grandfather of science fiction fandom, is an endangered species in fan communities online. When logic is thrown out the window, what fills the void left in its absence? Self-immolation. Fandom, in blind, ardent defense of its interests, has fallen back on a scorched earth policy of destroying the reputation of the classics to defend these modern sequels and remakes. They're just as much a menace to themselves as they are their opposition. Wait, are they the actual fandom menace?
What's it for? What are you doing? What could possibly be worth all this?
Movies and TV shows don't become truly bona fide classics by being poorly written. And I mean actual top-shelf films and television that have become immortal. I'm not referring to cult classics, which are often loved somewhat ironically. I mean products like Casablanca, Lawrence of Arabia, Psycho, Star Trek, Doctor Who, and Star Wars. These didn't earn their status by being known for poor storytelling. Up until recently, nobody looked back on these beloved entertainments and said, oh yeah, it was the Bush League writing that made these timeless. That doesn't happen. That's why Automan is a cult classic, while Murder, She Wrote is classic. You think your lifelong obsession with Star Wars is thanks to a movie with a sloppy story? Seriously? You think a mediocre movie could inspire 43 years of sequels, books, games, cartoons, TV series, merchandise, and compel a corporation to pay $4 billion to own it? And yet there's a new tactic in town with fandom. Trashing the classics. That's when the opposite party loves a spin-off movie or TV show to the extent that they will trash the classic that inspired it to justify the awfulness of the product they're defending. The way this works is you're in a conversation with someone about, say, Star Trek Into Darkness, and you say, wow, that was a horribly written screenplay, just a terrible story. And they say, come on man, be fair. It's not like Wrath of Khan was that well written either. Stop and think about your interactions with these people in discussions over the last few years, and I'll bet you can recall responses like this. I see it happening more and more. This cop-out has become the go-to tool in fandom's debate arsenal, and the intellectual dishonesty of this tactic is unbelievable. For now, let's table the combo to this move, the false equivalency. We'll explore that in a moment. First, let's just focus on the first punch in the trashing the classics combo, the sucker punch. On the surface, it plays as a simple manipulative reversal. Rather than answer for the shortcomings of the film or series they're defending, they put you on the back foot by trying to rattle your confidence in the original classic. By doing this, they attempt to avoid your question entirely. Example, instead of telling you where the explanation is in The Force Awakens for the origin of the First Order, there isn't one by the way, they counter that the original Star Wars didn't explain where the Galactic Empire came from. There is one, and it's even more complicated than that, but hold on to this thought because we're coming back to it. Instead of justifying the terrible animation in Thundercats Roar, the fandom will counter without basis or thought that the original Thundercats had terrible animation also. Now, you know I have no love for the Thundercats, but even I'll be the first to say the animation in the original Thundercats series was some of the best syndicated animation of the 80s. That's an observable truth. The dishonesty of this tactic rivals even the "it wasn't made for you" tactic of the past few years. You idiots who say that do realize what PG-13 means, right? Hollywood aims that PG-13 rating at the widest possible audience deliberately to get the biggest box office, and they focus group movies to death to appeal to, say it with me, everyone! Anyone who says it wasn't made for you should take a wiffle bat swing to the mouth. It wasn't made for you! The negative magnitude of trashing the classic to defend your beloved piece of crap runs deeper than a simple cheap shot in a conversation. The endemic move of trying to poke holes in a classic to shore up a weak modern installment falsely impugns the reputation of the classic amongst people who have never seen it. Over time, these fans are actually destroying long-term interest in the respective franchise because in the media and in casual conversation, what were once known as legendary entertainments are reduced to a collective meh after years and years of people throwing shade at them to defend modern trash filmmaking. Their friends go to the modern ones that they keep hyping only to find the films are garbage, and then they have absolutely no interest in watching the original. We've all heard that story from one of our clueless friends who wanted to initiate someone who had never seen Star Wars into the saga. And what do? They show them the prequels first. And then the next day they come back shocked and hurt and tell us that their friend doesn't want to watch any more Star Wars. If you'd shown them the best story first, the result might have been different. But even George Lucas had to be taught that hard lesson. Anyone remember the Star Wars 3D conversions? You probably don't, because he started in theaters with The Phantom Menace.
Oops.
And it's also self-abusive. These classics are the genesis for the fandom's interest in these franchises. They're the very reason the modern versions even exist at all. The cognitive dissonance here is on the level of going back to the past and killing your father because you don't want people calling your kid ugly. Kill your father and there is no kid to protect because you and the entire fandom go with it. We've seen this most starkly with the Star Wars series. In defense of the many plot holes and screenwriting issues with the sequel trilogy, the pro-Disney fandom since 2015's The Force Awakens often claim the original trilogy wasn't any better written than these films, nor were the characters any better developed. And in the past 5 years, both box office and overall merchandising sales have fallen each passing year. Overall interest in the franchise has deteriorated. The numbers don't lie. When you're constantly parroting that the old films are on par in terms of story and character development with the new films, which aren't very good, you're only poisoning the well from which these modern films came from. And you're poisoning the well on a desperate lie just to save face. It's okay to like a bad movie, but it's gratuitous to tear a great movie down to defend that bad movie. But, Michael, you say, how can you claim with certainty that they're lying? Because franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek and Doctor Who don't have massive fan bases because they're mediocre. They have massive fan bases stretching out decades and decades because those original stories were incredible. You don't get fan communities in these numbers continuously for decades when the original movie or series was sloppy or even just okay. If that was the case, something like Tron would have become a massive fandom by now. It didn't. Occasionally, when challenged on their attempt to sucker punch, instead of pulling out the shiv known as the false equivalency, they'll use their child like a human shield in a hostage situation. They'll talk about how these franchises are made for 12-year-olds, they'll quote something George Lucas said one time in one lone interview, and then they'll tell you how their kid liked it and that's all that matters. Again, these films and TV shows have traditionally been aimed at everyone. PG-13 is the hot rating studios want to earn for that very reason. Broadest audience possible and all that. You don't get lifelong fans from childhood into adulthood of Barney and Teletubbies. You don't have massive lines of adults sitting around watching Barney's debut broadcast or movie premiere. You did for Star Wars in 1977, you did for Star Trek in 1966, and you did for Doctor Who in 1963. Using George Lucas's comments that his films are for 12-year-olds as a defense is foolish, and his very next comment was literally about the critics being mean. Firstly, if your children are so important that you'll use them as a defense in your arguments, why is it not important to give them well-written, coherent entertainment? You'll use your kids to justify your defense of crappy products, but you don't think enough of your kids to want to give them the best products possible? The The first two Star Wars films were made with a focus on having the screenplays work subtextually on multiple levels, so it would resonate with both children and adults. This was stated many times by producer Gary Kurtz, and it's been proven out in the almost invincible and universal popularity across all age groups for these original films. Lucas dumbed down his own story in subsequent films after parting ways with Kurtz. That's why Kurtz didn't stick around, and that's why the subsequent films have been criticized and debated heavily. And now, retroactively, with resentment still very much at play, he says these films are for kids and kids alone, even though it's adults and adult money over the past 3 decades that made him a billionaire. He very much knows it, and he knows that argument is a cop-out.
Why do you say the kids thing?
Well, it is a kids' film. Adults like it. It's for everybody.
It wasn't little kids in the early 90s that were buying all of the expanded universe novels. It was adults. Let's say for the sake of argument, these types of franchises are for kids and kids only. What are you doing in the conversation then? If you're such a superior and enlightened adult that rides above all this, why are you getting mad and jumping into these discussions? Why are you still a fan of these properties? Shouldn't you have outgrown them? Shouldn't you be playing golf or looking at your stock portfolio? Doing those adult things? If you truly believe these franchises are just for kids, get out of these conversations. Sell your memorabilia and never discuss them again outside of interactions with your own children. Be that indifferent, superior grown-up you posture as in these arguments. Live your cliched truth. And while we're on the subject of your children, using your kids as a justification when arguing the quality of a movie you like is as intellectually dishonest as it gets. No one has explained this better than YouTuber Stewbagful, so allow me to share his brief thoughts on this cheap, bankrupt debate tactic.
Really? Is your 7-year-old every 7-year-old that could potentially be watching? Can one 7-year-old speak for all 7-year-olds? Yeah, because 7-year-olds have a hive mind. Every 7-year-old will always have the same reaction. Yeah, I love how our society uses children like currency to buy their opinion more credence with a whopping one personal example.
By now, in their clumsy defense of crappy entertainment, they've called out the original classic as equally inferior. They've possibly made the claim these new films, quote, aren't made for us, and maybe even invoked the alleged preferences of their own children in a cheap attempt to buff their debate strength. Assuming by this point the discussion hasn't ended and you've asked them to prove their claim that the original was inferior, here comes the most frequent combo move. First, the sucker punch, claiming broadly that the original was just as bad, followed by the false equivalency in their attempt to prove it.
All things being equal, Mr. Scott, I would agree. However, things are not equal.
And this always goes badly for them. Remember what I said in Canon is overrated? These people are terrible with details, and now they're going to attempt to use details to prove their point. False equivalence is a logical fallacy in which two incompatible arguments appear to be logically equivalent when in fact they are not. When I posted the Canon is overrated video, I was met with a chest-thumping attempt to trash the original Star Wars trilogy to prove the sequel trilogy wasn't any worse, by alleging similar writing issues in the original films to the plot problems I'd illustrated in the sequel trilogy. The one at the top of the list? That establishing where the First Order came from doesn't matter because the original Star Wars didn't explain where the Galactic Empire came from. First of all, the movie did explain it, and quite comprehensively.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Fear will keep the local systems in line.
But sequel fans probably zone out during this scene because it doesn't have explosions and lightsabers. Secondly, there's this thing called cause and effect. And when you're in the first presented chapter of a multi-part story, such as the original Star Wars, you are setting up the game board. It's only when those pieces move in subsequent chapters that the audience needs to see how the pieces moved so they know how they got into their current positions, because the audience knows what the chessboard looked like at the end of Return of the Jedi. Let me give you two examples from two very different series. In Fellowship of the Ring, they don't need to explain to us where the Shire came from. There's a place called the Shire where hobbits are happy and live. Great. But what if in the Two Towers we see the Shire destroyed? And then when the hobbits return to the Shire in Return of the King, it's all back to normal somehow without any explanation. You see how the first one needs no explanation, but the subsequent ones do? Here's another example from a much simpler film series. In the martial arts film China O'Brien, we don't need an explanation for how China's father is sheriff of the local town when the film begins. He's the sheriff of the town. The bad guys murder him. At the end of the film, China is the newly elected sheriff. Now at the beginning of China O'Brien 2, she's still sheriff. But what if at the start of China O'Brien 2, she suddenly wasn't sheriff anymore? And what if instead one of the bad guys from the original film was now the new sheriff without any explanation? That's cause and effect. You don't need to explain the origin of the train when it's sitting at the station. But once the train gets rolling, if it loses the caboose, you better explain to the passengers how that happened. When a movie as stupid and satirical as Iron Sky has more explanation in it for how Nazis ended up on the moon than The Force Awakens has for explaining how the Galactic Empire became the First Order, you can't say this movie is well written. Knowing how a government became evil in the first story isn't necessary, even though they did explain it, but whatever. Seeing the good guys defeat the evil government in the third story, only to have the evil government back again in the fourth story without explanation, that's a problem. And comparing those two as if they are identical is a false equivalency. Okay, now let's take another often cited example. Luke's training versus Rey's training. People love to say that Luke wasn't properly trained any better than Rey's now infamous lack of training. Rey was on Ahch-To for a few days and Luke was only on Dagobah for a few days, according to these people. Let's break it down. Yoda didn't refuse to train Luke nearly as long as Luke refused to train Rey. Seconds versus days. Also keep in mind the Falcon's hyperdrive is broken. The Falcon is now at sublight speeds. According to the movie, the hyperdrive doesn't work. Considering it takes 37,000 years with our technology to go 1 light year, and Bespin is over 1,000 light years from Hoth, even if we give Star Wars sublight technology the mulligan of being faster than our technology, you're still talking several months of travel at best.
Bespin is pretty far, but I think we can make it.
Not including the time they spent inside the space slug. Sequel trilogy devotees have gotten used to J.J. Abrams' revision of space travel as being nearly instantaneous. He did this to Star Trek as well, but that's not how it works in a properly written story. In the original films of both Star Wars and Star Trek, space travel required some waiting, and that allowed the characters to develop and build the plot between destinations.
Will you please sit down?
Luke had exponentially more training than Rey over a much longer period of time from a far more willing and skilled teacher. And even then he was told he didn't have enough training and shouldn't leave. But he did anyway, and had his rear end handed to him and tried to attempt suicide to prevent being captured.
Suicide? Wait, I want to get this on tape, okay?
Again, trying to justify Rey's lack of training by claiming Luke had no training is a massive false equivalency. Finally, there's the defense tactic of justifying the main plot contrivances of the sequel trilogy by claiming the original films have always been filled with major plot contrivances.
Erroneous! Erroneous!
This is, sadly, a defense based on retconning of the story over the past 3 decades in newer installments of the film series. Many Star Wars fans still actually believe that George Lucas had every minor detail of the saga planned out in advance, even though that couldn't be farther from the truth. This lack of production knowledge amongst most Star Wars fans is also why you can put up a meme of C-3PO from a deleted scene on Echo Base in Empire Strikes Back, and everybody suddenly thinks they've discovered the Lost Ark, when in actuality this information has been available for decades. Your average Star Wars fan doesn't know much about the production history. A recent Kylo Ren Reacts video from YouTuber Auralnauts is the perfect example of this defense method. I want to add before I go into this that I love the Kylo Ren Reacts videos. He's hilarious. I subscribe to his channel. And this is not an attack on Auralnauts as a content creator. So to outline the setup for this problem, if you take The Force Awakens as an example, the map to Luke Skywalker, a girl who is the most powerful Force user in the galaxy, and the Millennium Falcon are all on the planet of Jakku at the same time. And Finn is able able to wander out of the desert in the exact right spot to meet Rey, while Han Solo is conveniently and randomly right overhead in space by literal coincidence. In playing devil's advocate in defense of these types of plot contrivances for which the sequel trilogy is plagued, Oral Knots uses the original film as an example of this issue having always been a part of Star Wars. He provides a still showing Ben Kenobi's hut and how every major thing in the scene is conveniently connected. But there's a major problem with that argument. As convenient and watertight as it might sound, this comparison of his to defend the claim that the original film is as contrived as the sequel trilogy does not take into account that the sequel trilogy was contrived from the blank page, while the contrivances in this scene from the original film were forced upon it by subsequent story retcons in future films. If you track the story developments of the saga through the treatments and screenplays when the original Star Wars was made, only one of these absurdities, as Oral Knots puts it, was there. 1. The droids weren't associated with Anakin at all until the prequel films added that to the story. And, point of order, R2-D2 was originally Padme's robot, even in that retconned mythology. Leia wasn't Luke's sister until the script development for Return of the Jedi. Up until that film, she and Luke were never intended to be related. Luke wasn't Vader's son either. That wasn't decided on until the development of The Empire Strikes Back. In fact, Anakin and Vader were two separate people at this point. The original draft of Empire even has Anakin's ghost on Dagobah talking to Luke. Only Ben being Vader's master is at play in this scene, and notably, not Anakin's master as well. It's implied in the dialogue that Ben and Anakin were peers in the Jedi Order. And it's worth mentioning, of all these piled-on absurdities, only one was met without any major criticism, Darth Vader being Anakin Skywalker. Sure, it caused some awkward problems in the subsequent films that resulted in the whole point of view joke.
'Cause technically it's true from a certain point of view.
But by and large, it was embraced by the filmmakers and the audience. The rest of these developments have not been as widely appreciated and have only eroded the narrative credibility of the series. And almost every one of these additional changes was made unilaterally by George Lucas in his emotionally driven race for revisionism. Even Leia being Luke's sister was decided upon during the filming of Jedi because Lucas was tired of making Star Wars films. And at the time, he decided he no longer wanted to do episodes 7 through 9, so he needed to tie up the loose ends by the end of Return of the Jedi. And as bad as it is to suddenly change Leia into Luke's sister, it's nothing compared to making C-3PO Anakin's childhood hobby. That's not the fault of the original trilogy. That blame lies squarely with the prequels. To say the original Star Wars is guilty of contrived absurdities from the starting line like Force Awakens is very misleading. Star Wars was wholly crafted and produced without any of these things in the story, and that's why the story of that film feels both credible and compelling. It's simply a superior script to anything the sequel films have offered. Objectively superior. There is no honesty or honor in tearing down the original classic when your new hotness is criticized for being stupid. If you cannot defend a film on its own merits and instead must shift the conversation to trashing the classic, I think you know just as well as I do that you've already lost the argument. Stop stabbing dishonest holes in good movies and TV shows to defend bad ones. Stop claiming these films aren't made for the widest possible audience. Stop claiming they're made only for kids. And stop hiding behind your kids to justify your adult opinion. Imagine believing you love your team so much, you're willing to bench your best player to defend some freshman player in the game. You're ready to destroy what made the franchise successful and what made you passionate about the franchise in the first place to defend the latest entry. Unreal. Yeah, the real menace to the fandom are the defenders of this corporately created Hollywood garbage, who default to trashing the original classics that created these franchises in the first place.